Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at chapter 5 of Guns, Germs, and Steel and taking a look specifically at how plant migration affected how the world became. One of the things that we're going to get into today is taking a look at how plants moved from certain areas to other areas where they became staples of the culture, but they didn't actually originate in it. As always, I will be only going over a little bit about what's in the book. I actually skip over a huge portion about carbon dating that would be really interesting, and I would highly suggest that you go and check it out for yourself. Alright, so let's get into it. Part 2, the rise and spread of food production. Chapter 5. When we trace food production back to its beginning, the earliest sites provide another surprise. Far from being modern breadbaskets, they include areas ranking today as somewhat dry or ecologically degraded: Iraq and Iran, Mexico and the Andes, parts of China, and Africa's shale zone. Why did food production develop in these seemingly rather marginal lands and only later in today's most fertile farmlands and pastures? One of the things we need to take a look at here is that we're not necessarily expecting to see how things develop in a way that would make sense sometimes. What could end up actually happening is that we see a pattern of things that happen and move from one portion to another. We don't have areas where we should be expecting things to play out in a specific way. What could be happening in this situation is that because these areas are somewhat dry, they don't have the natural resources that you would see needed for hunter-gatherer societies. We're not seeing a plethora of different creatures or animals or plants that would necessarily be seen as needed to support those smaller tribes. So one of the ways that they could be supplementing what they're trying to eat is with food that they plant. Finding things like we talked about in the last video when we discussed world building, finding things in the world that they can eat and actually using that to supplement their meager meat intake. These are the things that we need to keep in mind when we're talking about our stories. We're creating a realistic world, not always one that's going to make sense, but something that fits in line with what we can expect in the real world. So when we write our stories, we are creating these stories that they have a level of authenticity. And these are the things that would create a, that's weird type of mindset in our readers. By creating a world that's actually realistic and giving experiences of these people developing these systems and agriculture, we show a world that is real, that is deep, that is meaningful to the people living in our story. Why did food production develop first in these seemingly rather marginal lands and only later in today's most fertile farmlands and pastures? In a few places, it developed independently as a result of local people domesticating local plants and animals. In most other places, it was instead imported in the form of crops and livestock that had been domesticated elsewhere. Since those areas of non-independent origins were suitable for prehistoric food production, as soon as domesticates had arrived, why did the peoples of those areas not become farmers and herders without outside assistance? By domesticating local plants and animals? One of the things that makes sense for us as people is that we're always trying to find the least expensive route. And what I'm talking about here is not necessarily monetarily, but rather in terms of energy. When we're talking about food, we're talking about energy and nutrition. How much does the food that we are intaking give us the energy to do the tasks that we're looking to do to survive? How much food can you get from a deer? How's the proteins going to be to give us a beyond tomorrow mindset? That's one of the things that we need to keep in mind when we're telling our stories, is how are these people surviving not just the day-to-day, but also long-term? Are your hikers have enough food and resources so they can survive for more than 24 hours? Are your hunter-gatherer people, are they able to survive by just living off the land? Or do they need to have systems in place where they can provide food for themselves outside of what would normally be found in the area? For instance, if you had a culture where they were moving with the herds, did they have areas where they planted crops that they could just leave, so when they came back to this area, they had food to supplement? This is particularly going to be true with certain types of colder climates where you cannot grow things in certain seasons. So some cases, and this is, I don't know if this is going to be talked about later in the book, but in some cases they'll actually mention about how they planted crops and just left it while they went with the herds, only to come back when the herds returned. These are some of the things that we can add to our story so we can add depth to what's going on and add to the living aspect of our story. Among those regions in which it was imported in the prehistoric era, why did the date of arrival also vary so greatly? For example, thousands of years earlier in southwestern Europe than in the southwestern United States. Again, among those regions where it was imported, why in some areas, such as southwestern United States, did local hunter-gatherers themselves adopt crops and livestock from neighbors and survive as farmers, while other areas, such as Indonesia and much of sub-equatorial Africa, the importation of food production involved a cataclysmic replacement of the region's hunter-gatherers by invading food producers. All these questions involve developments that determined which peoples become history's have-not and which became its haves. One of the things we need to be keeping in mind here is that we are not talking necessarily when we're writing our stories that it is easy, that is clean, that is this group bad or this group good. What happens is that, and I've mentioned this before, that we have people that are competing with the same areas. For some, it is hunter-gatherers trying to provide for themselves off the hunt, off the local wildlife, local fauna and flora, whereas people who are in the agricultural perspective, they are coming to find areas that they can plant easily. You also got to remember that not every area is going to have easy aerated soil that they can just come in and use. A lot of the times they have to come in and put a lot of work in beforehand. They have to remove stones. They have to get rid of trees. They have to get rid of plants. They have to get rid of animals that are all going to cause problems when it comes to actually farming their land. These are things that we need to keep in mind is when we're creating an agrarian culture, is that they have a fight, not just with starvation, not with the elements, but also nature as it pertains to the areas and the animals that are around. One of the things that some people fail to realize is that when you develop an area for agricultural reasons, even if we're not necessarily talking about herds, but even areas such as farmland, a lot of people will say we need to develop our farmland so that we can remove ourselves from needing meats. But the problem is that that requires a different perspective when it comes to developing plants. Certain plants require that you kill certain animals that are in the area, or else you're going to lose a lot of the crops. One of the things that we should pay attention to is it's not just the animals. So you have voles, or you have deer, you have smaller rodents that are known for eating plants that humans eat, but you also have sicknesses. If you have certain plants in close proximity to each other, different diseases and bugs will come in and destroy whole crops. This is what happens, and you have people who die because of this. An agrarian culture, while it gives us more food and more ability to provide food for the long term because we can store it better, doesn't mean that you're not going to have issues when it comes to producing it. Every system of food production has its issues, and it's not as cut and dry as some people would say. Before we can hope to answer these questions, we need to figure out how to identify areas where food production originated, when it arose there, and where and when a given crop or animal was first domesticated. Most domesticated plant and animal species differ morphologically from their wild ancestors. For example, the smaller size of the domestic cattle and sheep, the larger size of domestic chickens and apples, the thinner, smoother seed coats of domestic peas, and the corkscrew twisted rather than scimitar-shaped horns of domestic goats. One of the things that domestication does is it actually changes the DNA of the domesticated product, whether we're talking about plants or animals. For example, we specifically select different plants because they have better applications for what we're trying to do. There are mutations that take place that we are able to use and take advantage of, whereas others are not necessarily able to be used. For example, a wild almond is actually highly toxic. There's a chemical called cyanide in non-domesticated almond plants. So when we talk about certain types of animals and certain types of plants, we need to keep this in mind, that everything that we eat is actually an offshoot of a different wild creature or plant. That what we see today is not actually something that we could find out in the wild. Most of the time, what we use culturally, or what we use in an agrarian society, has actually been developed over thousands and thousands and thousands, if not longer, of years. So when we talk about not just plants, but we're also talking about creatures, for instance. So say you have in a world where you have a wild animal that you are looking to domesticate. How did the domestication process affect how it was designed or how it was shaped? Were the farmers selecting for different traits? If you have an herbivore that is a large creature, are they selecting for smaller, more manageable animals? Are they looking for a sweeter milk? Are they looking for a tougher hide for leather? These are all things that need to be taken into account when we develop our stories. These are all things that play in how our story develops and creates a world that is livable. For example, chickpeas are widely grown by traditional farmers from the Mediterranean and Ethiopia east of India, with the latter country accounting for 80% of the world's chickpea production today. One might therefore have been deceived in supposing that chickpeas domesticated in India, but as it turns out, the ancestral wild chickpeas occur only in southeastern Turkey. These are things that we don't take into account when we create our stories, is that our worlds need to be just as varied and dynamic. What we can have sometimes in our story is you have situations where our characters are going through different environments and going through different things, and they can see how the overarching product that they use in their day-to-day came from this area. Just like we use the ruins of an ancient culture in certain types of stories to convey a idea, the same can be used in our food. These are all ways that we could be telling additional stories within our stories so that we can have a very heavy, well thought out story that our readers can connect to. For instance, the earliest known cultivated emmer wheat comes from the Fertile Crescent around 8500 BC. Soon thereafter, the crop appears progressively further west, reaching Greece around 6500 BC and Germany around 5000 BC. These dates suggest domestication of emmer wheat in the Fertile Crescent, a conclusion supported by the fact that the ancestral wild emmer wheat is confined to the area extending from Israel to western Iran and Turkey. When we're talking about things like cereals, is what we will use this term later on, is you have different types of plants that provide different nutritional products, have different nutritional bases. So wheat is one of those few plants that actually gives you a fair amount of protein in it. If you ever take a look at things like oatmeal, you will notice that there's a fair amount of protein in the product. There's a fair amount of protein in what you can get out of a plant. This is not a common thing. Typically, you don't find protein as much as you would for meat in plants. There are other plants such as soy. Beans in general have a high amount of protein as opposed to other types of food. Like lettuce doesn't have that much protein. So when we're talking about wheat, we're seeing that wheat has higher levels of protein than other plants. So wheat is one of those things that they plant because given the times and given how they're paying attention to how the food is making them feel over generations, this is how they understand it, that these are generational traits or ideas that are learned, that they don't understand what's going on. Not until modern technology came around did they actually understand what is actually happening and why things work and why things don't. All they know is that everything is tried and tested over those generations. So you have a third generation farmer that uses wheat for food, and they are going to be better off than somebody who just uses lettuce. These are things that we need to keep in mind in our stories, is that these people who are living in these worlds are not just plopped in there with having no understanding of what's going on around them. They have generations and generations of received knowledge, knowledge that's been gifted to them by their ancestors of how to survive in this world. It's only when our characters divert or turn away from that knowledge that they begin to suffer. These are things that we can learn from our own history, and we can imply these into our own stories and how we have certain wisdoms that are passed on that we need to make sure that our readers understand that this is a lived-in world. At one extreme, areas in which food productions arose altogether independently with domestication of many indigenous crops, and, in some cases, animals, before the arrival of any crops or animals from other areas. There are only 5 such areas for which the evidence is at present detailed and compelling: Southwest Asia, also known as the Near East or Fertile Crescent; China; Mesoamerica, the term applied to central and southern Mexico and adjacent areas of Central America; the Andes of South America, and possibly the adjacent Amazon basin as well; and the eastern United States. Here's a map detailing each of these areas. One of the things that was mentioned in the book is that if you notice the question marks, these are some of the areas that we aren't sure if they arose independently or if they were brought over from one area to another. A migration, as I mentioned in the title of this video, a migration of plants from one area where you could grow crops to another portion of the area. If we pay attention to these things, we are able to create an idea of what the world looked like centuries and millennia ago. These are not people who have a ton of food and resources that we have today, so we need to put ourselves in those mindsets of them starving almost daily. It's particularly from our own perspective of what plenty is. They didn't have that, so that changes how they viewed the world and how they viewed what's going on around them. The vast majority of these people who were living in these areas, they were solely focused on surviving the day-to-day. They didn't care about what's going on politically outside of their sphere of experience. What their sphere of experience comes down to their tribe, their family, and their food. There's not a lot that they are thinking beyond, which is why it takes so long to develop these ideas into something that can become world spanning. Food is one of those things that was developed slowly over time and developed, and plants were selected over the course of millennia for things that would give them the most nutrition. Not because they understood what nutrition was, but because they knew over the course of their lives and the course of the generations what was beneficial and what wasn't. The plant that was less beneficial was left off. The plant that didn't give energy was ignored. These are things, even if it's not necessarily poisonous, but things that your ancestors, our ancestors, were thinking about all the time. They would test and retest foods. Is this a food that I can use to help me do something? Whether it is medicines or whether it is food. We see different things, and we see things from a very distinct perspective. From my understanding, it was not uncommon for certain medieval salads to include things like dandelions. While there weren't as much nutritional value, they added something to the day-to-day food intake of our ancestors, something that we should be keeping in mind. Those imported domesticates may be thought of as founder crops and animals because they founded local food production. The arrival of founder domesticates enabled local people to become sedentary and thereby increased the likelihood of local crops evolving from wild plants that were gathered, brought home, and planted accidentally, and later planted intentionally. These are all things that we need to keep in mind is when we're building our world, is that we're not building just a two-dimensional or a one-dimensional world, but rather something that is lived in. I keep on going over this again because for me this is extremely important when we write our worlds, not just on the page but in our minds. A lot of how our writing comes down to is how a world functions. If we don't understand the building blocks of how society came to be, we can misunderstand the process which our world comes to life. If we create a world that's similar, yet different to our own. This reduces our requirement to explain what's different, which includes things like why things are the way they are. Now, a lot of the time, if we create a reasonable understanding of how a world works, our readers will understand it. But if we try to make sure we go that extra mile to understand how our own world works, we can add certain elements to our stories so that they can increase the connections with our reader. All right, everybody, that's all I had for today. As always, I will be linking the book in the description below. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please leave it in the comments below. Until next time, bye.
I am a poor, wayfaring stranger. I'm traveling through this world of woe, yet there's no sickness, toil, nor danger in that bright land to which I go.